Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Committee of the Whole budget meeting for Wednesday, March 26th, 2025. And looking around the horn here, all council members are present, so I can declare that we have 100% turnout. So we'll move on to the agenda, and is there any additions that anyone would like to make to the agenda? No? Would somebody like to move approval of the agenda, please? Moved by Councillor Best, second by Councillor Allen. All those in favor, please vote. Okay, please raise your right hand. Motion carried. Okay. All right, we'll move on to disclosure of interest. Is there any member of council that would like to disclose a conflict of interest of any of the items that we're coming up with here today? No? All right, we'll move on. And our first presentation, and welcome back from the sick bed, our illustrious CAO, Mr. Scott Conrad, and he's going to open up with the proposed operating budget and water utility budget. And I think before that he has a few words he'd like to say on a personal note. And get the podium open there.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, Council. I'd like to start this morning with an acknowledgement of the effort and dedication of the many staff who contribute to this effort. I guess the shortest way I can say it is your efforts and contributions are very much appreciated. At the risk of singling folks out, I would like to provide sort of a special acknowledgement to Kevin Wheaton, Tyler Honeywood, and Katrina Ruth. And I guess knowing the three of you as I do, I think I can say this. I know you wouldn't say this, but working with the rest of us at times must be like herding cats. So from one of the cats, thank you very much. I tried to find a couple of words here this morning that sort of very succinctly would describe how I feel about Greg Barr's leadership. And one of the words I come up with was stalwart. And so under Greg's stalwart leadership, the exercise of compiling the annual capital, operating, and reserve budgets is a real team effort. And I know with what everyone's been going through, one of the common themes that I've heard over and over again from people who have been here for a very long period of time or a very short period of time is that you worked with Greg Barr. You didn't work for Greg Barr. And from a personal note, I can say that I don't think there's truer words that can be said. He was so collegial, so inclusive, so welcoming of people's input, and had such a way about him. So I think, you know, that's one word that I would use. We're very fortunate, I think, here of inheriting a very solid foundation in terms of municipal finance. So I also want to acknowledge that. Things like how we budget and use reserves, the smooth tax rates, that is something that is pretty unique in municipal circles, in particular in Nova Scotia. And it's one of the largest reasons why we have a solid green track record on our financial condition index. So having said that, I don't think I could stand in front of you and say that Greg Barr's fingerprints and building on that solid foundation it can't be scored enough. It really needs to be underscored. So you'll see here in a very short period of time a couple of my slides where we've had particular challenges in capital infrastructure and of taking expenditures from the $4 million mark to the 40-some million dollar mark. And not just for routine things, but things like improvements to wastewater, very essential core things that we need to do. Greg Barr did that in a way that either maintained and in most instances improved our financial condition index. And I can't help but think of, for those of us who were at, and there was a lot of us thankfully at the Celebration of Life, And the family speaking at that service about when they came into this building, and they joked, they have such a sense of humor like Greg did, about not realizing how smart Greg Barr was. And I'm sitting way in the back or standing way in the back of that service, and I thought, ladies, if you only knew half of it. If you only knew half of it. And so it's taking, Greg took that solid foundation, he took the work of others in an inclusive way, in his congenial, I'll give you a hug type of personality, and then built on that and made it so much better and so much more meaningful. So I guess basically that's what I'd like to say. There's so many different things that we can think about in terms of Greg and the team that he built and how much he valued his team. And it's just that one, you know, I always have to find something to ground my mind in, and it's just the way he built upon that solid foundation and made it even, he put a house on the foundation. So that's something we can look towards in terms of his legacy and continue on that path that he set forward for us.
Well said.
So as the mayor mentioned, I would like to do the first couple sections of this presentation, and then we turn it over to Katrina to do a deeper dive into some of the details. And both of us at any point would be open to questions, although my preference would be you wait for Katrina for the questions, but you can ignore that, I guess. So at a start, generally, we do talk about the uniqueness of municipal government and the fact that we operate under the Municipal Government Act. So there's specific provisions in the Municipal Government Act, and then there's regulations that have been enacted under the Municipal Government Act that really guide municipal finance. So just as a quick refresher, there's provincial law out there that requires a balanced budget. So we can't have a planned deficit. So you often hear about deficit budgeting in other orders of government. So under law, we cannot. Our revenues have to match our expenditures. We can also not use long-term debt to balance operating budgets. So our self-set of balancing accounts in the operating fund cannot use long-term debt as a revenue source or a source of funding, rather. Municipalities, the third point that I list here, utilize what is referred to as fund accounting. And funds are separate accounting entities. And I can recall one of our councillors who has some background in the village, and we often talk about water utilities. But when I think about fund accounting, my mind usually goes to water utilities. So for example, if you have experience in the private sector and you're preparing your income tax, you write your assets down and you can do your capital cost allowance or your depreciation to underscore or to diminish the amount of income tax you may have to pay. In a water utility, you depreciate your assets and you have to physically cut a check from your operating account and put it into a depreciation fund. So that builds up a nest egg that you have to do. So when you set your water rates, for example, in terms of fund accounting, so many pennies would go into paying for chlorine, so many pennies would be going in for person time of operators and whatnot, and so many pennies would be going in to fund a depreciation reserve. Revenue or funding, in other words, used in one fund cannot be used in another fund. So it's really a good way to know at the end of the year, we projected to do this in sewer and we have this type of result in sewer. There's no intermingling between operating or water and sewer. Sewer is sewer, it's its own discrete fund. Excuse me. So those funds, I'm going to attribute some credit here. This is one of Katrina's many graphics that is in the document that's in front of you this morning. And today we're really looking at the general operating fund and the water operating fund, the regional sewer operating fund, and the reserve fund. So a couple of weeks ago, you had a first look at capital funds. So those are all the different funds that you see across in yellow, and then you kind of see some funds that follow out from that. And today we're going to look at the first one, general operating, and then the two utilities, the water and the sewer, and then the reserve funds. So in terms of a framework, although we're not going to talk about capital in any great degree here this morning, there is a linkage between operating budgets and capital budgets. So on the operating side, that's where you need to generate the rates. And for one example is those rates have to be sufficiently set that they can make principal and interest payments on long-term debt, and they have to be sufficiently set that they can contribute towards reserves when budgeted for. So there's a huge influence for us with capital, even in what we're talking about here this morning. So as important as what you looked at the other week, there's crossovers here to what we're talking about this morning. I note here that the province tracks the financial condition of municipalities. I referred to that a few minutes ago, referred to as FCIs. And King's Capital Fund FCIs have remained strong or improved despite cost increases. So for example, you can see here in 18-19, our capital budget was $4.6 million, and what was presented to you back a couple of weeks ago has now grown to $48 million. At that same time, you can see that the debt to taxable assessment ratio has actually dropped significantly. It's on a bit of an incline here now, but is leveled out. So it's lower than what it was, even at less than half of that expense. You can see here that our debt to service burden ratio very similarly has gone down and has come up a bit, but that was signaled during your presentation that we are thinking that we need to have a little bit more strength in our reserves so that we cushion the impact on our principal and interest payments in our operating budget. So again, that's the tie-in, right? So we signaled a couple of weeks ago that we thought it was important that our operating budget be sufficient, that we can contribute to that so we can maintain a really healthy debt to service ratio. So key considerations on the operating side of it, just so that, and maybe I'll phrase it this way, like what are the tools that you have as the Board of Governance to work with? So you have, in my estimation, you have at least these four. So you can look at the level of expenditures in order to come in with that legislative required balanced budget. You can look at your revenue requirements. You can look at operating reserves, and I'm going to go into each of these a little bit more here in a second. And you can look at transfers to capital reserve. So there's sort of four levers here that you can use at your discretion to come in with a balanced framework. So in terms of expenditures, instead of going over, the $60-some million, I chose to pick a graphic here that just talks about the increase from this year over last year. So the increase year over year, budget-wise, is in rough numbers $4.5 million. Of that, you can see that on the expenditure side, about 2.8 million of that is really non-discretionary. So 64% of that $4.5 million, someone else has told you you're going to cover that increase. The RCMP sends you a bill. Education sends you a bill. It's those types of things that are coming down the pipe. PVSC sends you a bill. So these particular ones, you can't go back and say, can I negotiate the bill? Can I have input on the bill? It doesn't work that way. You get the bill and you pay the bill. So at least 64% of that increase is attributed to non-discretionary items. I'm going to jump to the bottom one here for a second. In terms of other budget influences, material, supplies, and utilities, purchase, service, and human resources, I would argue a lot of that is relatively fixed as well. So when we all go to the gas pump except, well, most of us go to the gas pump, some of us plug in, I guess. If we go to the gas pump, we're dealing with the same, the municipality is dealing with the same inflationary pressures as individuals and citizens are dealing with, for the most part. So where our costs are going up, so you have those pressures and influences that have to be adjusted by CPI. The middle category, or 14%, is the strategic plan influence. And again, my bias, my bent here that I'm relaying to you this morning is that, I don't usually use names, I'll continue not to use names, but I have another counselor that I parked a note, what they said at one point in one of the meetings is, if we're standing still, we're standing still. And people are looking to move here, and people are looking to retire here, and people are looking to start families here. Especially people coming into our municipality, there's oftentimes an expectation of what they want. They want basic. They want to make sure that there's adequate fire service. They want to make sure that there's not a problem flushing the toilet or draining the sink. They also want amenities. So whether it's the Harvest Moon Trail or those types of things. So 14% in terms of advancing the community and not just being static is $620,000. That's not a lot of money in the big context of taking that we're working on with you, your strategic influence, your strategic plan over the next 3 years, to operationalize that is not a big chunk of that increase of $4.5 million. So that's some comment on expenditures, a little bit more, and one more slide, at least on expenditures, is you have to realize that of that largest bucket that I referenced here, 64%, a good chunk of those programs in some shape or form are tied to uniform assessment, and uniform assessment is calculated 1 year in a lag. So it's based on, so you can have a really robust year uniform assessment, and that's how your current year is billed, but maybe the other expenditures in the current year and your other revenue sources aren't as strong. So there's a bit of cushioning that you have to account for in terms of properly planning for that. You can recall here a couple of years ago we had very high inflation, and now inflation has leveled out. But uniform assessment, could have been influenced by that, and now we're having to deal with that positive influence in a year where other things don't have that type of growth. This one here always amazes me, and it's something that I routinely look at. So the Annapolis Valley Regional Center for Education, it's almost a $1.5 million increase over last year. So our projected bill for this year, April 1, is $17.1 million. Of that total number is going to the Annapolis Valley Regional Center for Education. That's a very large number. So we continue pressure in future budget periods due to current assessment growth. And again, this is what I'm referring to with this 1 year in lag and looking at how things are calculated. That was expenditure. In terms of revenue requirements, again, if you hopefully are permitting me to just to give you some opinion here, or some bias, is a need to increase our capital reserve contributions to smooth rates and catch up to market values. So I guess the comparison I would make, if you're a homeowner, particularly if you're a first-time homeowner, I suppose, it's to your advantage to have a nest egg that you can go and make a down payment with. So that you have a smaller mortgage payment if you have a larger down payment. And so this is the type of thing that we have to keep up with that capital reserve contributions, because we pull so much out of reserves. Well, first of all, we go out and we have to have a proper staffing resource to get as much third-party money as we can get. So let's not forget that. We're doing a sewer project. Let's pick an example. We want to get as much third-party money into that project as we can. We then want to look at how much can we take out of the reserve that we've built up, and then what can we finance out of long-term debt with keeping that ratio in mind. And all of that is intended to do what? Is intended to year over year to smooth the tax rate, so that property owners' tax rates aren't doing this all the time. And let's be honest, they don't typically do this. They typically, if they go up again. Typically, they don't come down. So you need that contribution to capital reserves to help smooth those rates. I would have to ask, and well, maybe it's not fair, but how long ago did we do that impairment on sewer? 3 years ago? 4 years ago? 3 years ago? So 3 years ago, excuse me for turning around. 3 years ago, our finance staff did what we refer to as an impairment test. So what's the value of our sewer reserves? Basically, can it handle our future requirements? And at that point in time, it was $14 million underfunded. So again, this goes back to the great foundation that was laid for us, and then Greg Barr taking that to the whole new level. Like, and we do things like impairment tests to figure out whether the amount in that reserve is adequate or not. So our capital reserves at present time are based on depreciated values. They're not based on market or replacement values. And we know inflation in the construction industry, up, and up, and up, right? So 14 million is probably really, really low in terms of the amount of money that we should be tucking away in these capital reserves. So maintaining an operating reserve to cushion potential deficits and smooth impacts on future rates. So again, trying to be transparent. One of the tools that you have to work with, you have your expenditures that you can rationalize. You can look at your sources of revenue and what you can do there. Another inflow into the operating budget is you can transfer from your operating reserve to balance your budget. But here's the deal with operating reserves, at least in my estimation, is that you need to maintain a healthy operating reserve because there's always the potential for a future year deficit. So, and the way municipal accounting or fund accounting works in our province, again under law, is any deficit that is incurred is the very first next year expenditure. So if you don't have so let's say, and as you know, we consolidate King's Transit and we consolidate Valley Waste. To be fair to those two large organizations, they are, like we are with sewer in particular, going through transformational change. So the Lawrencetown Station, for example, needs a major retrofit. The Kentville transfer station needs a major retrofit. You know, we know that we're trying to do something with buses that have in excess of 1 million kilometers on them, right? So is there chances that they could be off target even minimally, right? We consolidate them. So if we own 75% of Valley Waste, 75% of their balance sheet becomes part of our balance sheet. They incur a loss, we take 75% of that loss. You see where I'm going. So if you're to empty your operating reserve and use that to balance a current year budget, and either internally or one of the entities that we consolidate runs a deficit, then what are we going to pull out? What do we have left to pull out the bank to balance that budget, as opposed to having to put it on that year tax rate? So I'm just, again, saying it is an option. In my estimation for you, I don't know how much of an option it is, because I think you want to cushion the level of operating reserves that you maintain. Revenue requirements deal with non-discretionary and operating expenditures and implement council's strategic priorities. Other key budget considerations, inflationary pressures, growth and taxable assessment roll is projected to slow. So I know there's another councillor that often says, you know, what does a penny do? What does the lift do? And Katrina's going to define all of that stuff, but I know you've had those thoughts and discussions previously. You know, that's not, the capped assessment is predicated on CPI, and CPI has slowed. So the amount of, if I could call it sort of organic growth or lift in our assessment roll, is slowing. Unpredicted market conditions impacting interest rates and unpredictable market conditions. So, you know, that is something that, you know, 6 months ago, no one would be thinking about here in Nova Scotia or Canada, but things like tariffs and what type of impact that could have on debenture financing and whatnot can have a really material impact. The provincial service exchange will have an unknown impact on annual operating costs in subsequent years. So suffice it to say, we've talked about that, I can recall at least on 2 different occasions. The agreement that was signed with the province has what is referred to as a Schedule A, and Schedule A lists out a whole bunch of topics that the province fully intends to bring back to the negotiating table, things like local roads. So there's certainly a lot of unknowns there. The landscape for capital assets is expanding to include accessibility, climate change, and housing demand. So personally, my own bias, I don't think there's any of those that we shouldn't be doing. They're all extremely important, but they're cost pressures. To do the right thing often costs more money. Want to make something green? Costs more money. Want to make it accessible? Costs more money. Want to deal with the housing stuff that we desperately need to deal with? Costs more money. So another unknown. And additional staff resources are required to meet operating requirements. So I have a separate presentation on that if you bear with me on that last point. So you have some tools. What's the proposed approach? So the proposed approach, sort of jumping right to the end before Katrina takes you, or Ms. Roofs takes you through all of the detail, is to maintain the current tax rate. So utilize that assessment lift that she will describe. In my mind, that provides you with this ratepayer stability. So if you take out an amount out of your operating reserve to balance a budget this year, and something happens with the deficit, an unplanned deficit, then that could have a rate, that could be on stable tax rates in the coming years. You'll see in the budget that there's targeted measures to support ratepayers and community groups. So our program that helps out individuals that do not have the level of income to support the level of property taxes. There's, I think, quite a good proposed, it's governed by policy, but there is proposed increases in that program that people can apply here and get relief on their tax bill. Continued reserve management and monitoring. So important. I'm just a broken record here now, but talking about how we have to smooth that tax rate, and we do that by managing our reserves. Maintain acceptable levels of annual principal and interest payments. So that was that one that on the graph that was slightly going up that we have to be a little bit concerned about. But to do that means that we need to have a bigger kitty in reserve that we can rely on and try to get as much other people's money involved as well. So provincial and capital funding. Capital spend to address infrastructure requirements. And support of the local economy. So I think with that one is I've been fairly active with Director Kerrigan here in the last probably year, And I think people would be surprised at the amount that we contribute to the local economy, particularly in construction projects. I mean, we could go on and on, but we're building roads into Hants Border, you know, and desludging sewer. You know, we've spent, like, over the last 3.5 years, about 11.2 million at regional. We have plans, an optimization study ready to go in Canning. You know, so the list goes on and on. Like, there's tens of millions of dollars that we're putting into the local economy, that there is obvious benefit to that. So the proposed approach is the 85.3 in residential, the 228.7 commercial. Now again, Katrina's going to walk you through it. When you're going through the document, you do know that we had this kind of a counterintuitive term. I wish I could think of a better one here off the seat of my pants, but we had negative growth in commercial assessment. So that's not a good indicator. We believe that, you know, that the data shows that these rates are competitive with other jurisdictions. And probably more important than just the rate is, what's more important in my mind is what comes out of people's back pocket, or, you know, is the residential tax effort measure remains below average. So our municipality is below average in terms of the residential tax effort that's borne by taxpayers. As I mentioned in a couple of slides back, targeted ratepayer relief program has been enhanced. And if you were to choose, and certainly not the recommendation to be clear, but if you were to choose providing a tax rate, residential tax rate, the average bill would see that at $20.48. And what I'm trying to say in terms of ratepayer stability, it's oftentimes there's a whole logic of financial thought behind that. You give someone something that don't really see much of a difference in terms of $20, but that if you have to come back in the next year or the year after and double or triple that to make up for lost ground, that's that ratepayer instability that I'm talking about. And that happens in Nova Scotia. So a tax rate adjustment may not be sustainable in future years, is what I was just trying to describe. In terms of the other budgets, in your document you'll see that, and as you know, that although it does come to council, water rates in Greenwood and Sandy Court, that ultimately when it leaves the council table, it's not the final say, it goes to the Board of Public Utilities, the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board. So we are in the midst now of recapitalization plan in Greenwood Water. As you know from prior presentations, there's a 5-kilometer line that we're installing in that area that I didn't mention a minute ago with our infusion of money in the local economy. And there is also a fully designed water plant for Greenwood. So those things will come through the wash here in the course of this coming April 1 fiscal year to you for consideration. Again, it's fund accounting. So when you take off the other people's money, provincial government money, the fund for that usually is the water rates. So that'll be a separate thing that'll come back to you at some point in time. This coming year, April 1 year. So wastewater, we know that there's inflationary pressures, there's significant capital spending, limited revenue streams, rates are not tied to the growth in property assessed values. So you can see here the metric that we use are dwelling counts or lot counts. So we don't get that automatic lift that we talk about through the assessment roll and the general tax rate. The metric is different, it's per unit. So if we have some growth in units, we see a lift. But a unit doesn't become 1.1 of a unit next year, as the tax is, for example, may be somewhat true in the assessment roll. We did not so long ago, a day or so planning session on the strategic plan, and we went around the table and people were asking for opinions, and I remember giving my opinion of what I thought the priorities for the municipality would be, and I gave you 3 to try to embellish to make the point, and the 3 I gave were sewer, sewer, and sewer. I wish I could stand here today and tell you that we have everything assembled in sewer. We don't. There is a very large study going on now that's been awarded for regional that Director Kerrigan's working on. In each of the other 7 plants that we're operating, very similar work has to happen. And some of this, can relate to things like receiving water studies and things that take, a period of time to figure out what is the technology you have to use and then what's the capital cost associated with that. So that's coming up. In this particular budget year, we're proposing modest increases in base rates. And again, as part of those base rates would go into these capital reserves that we're talking about. And the need to keep that capital reserve, that when it's combined with a reasonable level of debt, that your 599 or your 179 is not going crazy year over year, that we can maintain that at a relatively calm level in terms of increases. Future year considerations. So all of this this is today, what is my bias or thinking on what do we need to be looking at. So capital cost requirements and projections, particularly sewer, are being refined, as I just mentioned. Reserve and long-term debt requirements and modeling is also being refined. So we have these models, we use these models. They need to be updated, in particular to catch up to market conditions from depreciated values to replacement values in our reserves. So in other words, it's fine to have a reserve, but the reserve is not strong enough because the cost is much more market-wise now than what it was a couple of years ago, is not doing us justice. Bringing capital reserves to market values, just what I said, one of the challenges of pre-existing predominant property assessment taxation approach. So this is going to be a challenge, and I'm just attributing myself and no one else, so I'm willing to discuss and elaborate if you so wish. In my estimation, the municipality will need to consider alternative sources of revenue to address these challenges. You know, we're at a somewhat monumental point in time where our community is growing. It's growing significantly, and you know, we're trying to do our part with housing starts, and you know, what's our role predominantly in housing? Pipe services and roads. So and then how do you do that in these unprecedented times? So that's sort of the first section. I can stop there for a second, Mr. Mayor, before I go to the second one, if anyone has any.
Okay. Thank you. Any comments to the CAO? Councillor McPherson.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Through you to Scott. Thank you, Scott, for that presentation. Very clear and understandable, so I appreciate that. Evidently, there are inflationary pressures in all parts of the expenditures within the municipality, and therefore it is challenging to meet the requirements, financial requirements, without increased revenue sources. I would anticipate, at least I'll speak for myself, I guess, at this point, that increases in taxes would not be beneficial for our citizens currently, given the realities of personal budgets. There are a number of ways of increasing revenues, and the ones, a couple, I guess, that I want to speak to would be the role assessment and the increase, inflationary rate and the CPI, and that natural increase that happens. That's slowing. Inflation is slowing, and that's slowing. The second, and you just alluded to it here on the end, was increase in housing starts. We receive a monthly report from, I think, Kentville, Berwick, maybe Wolfville, and the municipality of Kings of housing starts. I'm wondering what the impact or what the projection is for revenue increases on increased housing starts, whether they are single or duplexes, or whether they are the larger proposals that we have been dealing with in council over the last number of months. Is that a significant increase in revenue that may soften some of the pressures that we're currently facing? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the councillor. So I'll attempt to ask part, and I'm going to deflect part of this to Ms. Javerick, so she's over there thinking about the blend of what we're seeing in terms of applications. But I personally know that we're north of 200 additions to, for example, sewer connections, which obviously helps the 599 number. Our problem is that even when we go out, and if we're fortunate enough to pick up a third from provincial and federal sources, or 33 cents on the dollar, in the past we've even been fortunate enough to pick up 73 cents, so we got to pick up 27 cents. But these projects are not $1 million projects. These projects are tending to be north of $10 million or $5 million projects, depending on where you are. So it's that's sort of one complication. So you have the complication of market conditions for either an installation or replacement are a lot higher, and they seem to be incredibly volatile. You know, we're not unlike a lot of Canadians right now. We're checking federal lists. You know, we're getting pipe produced, 5 kilometers of pipe produced, and is the resin stock coming from Canada? Is the resin coming from the United States? Is resin on the list? Is that subject to a tariff? So you have that type of pressure. So you have market conditions, you have fixing up where we are right now because a lot of our systems are just cresting its useful life. And then you have this third dimension where you have growth pressures. So we have, over the last, without any embellishment, in the last 5 days, I've spoke to 3 developers. And, you know, what can we do here? You know, is there any thought that we could extend a line there? So it's not just fixing up, it's extending out in some instances and doing infill even in some of our growth centers that can have water and sewer supply to promote that R5 or comprehensive neighborhood type of development. But I'm going to ask Ms. Javrick, so what do you see in terms of single family versus duplex versus the R5 or comprehensive neighborhood?
Difficult to answer that beyond the fact that those files that you see coming to council, unfortunately, are setting up the rights to do it. At this point, we've not seen a lot of those projects evolve into a permit. So we're still seeing a bit of a delay on those numbers. We are starting to see a decline in single-family development numbers versus multi-units, if that's helpful.
So if I can paraphrase, she's saying that at present day, interest or application is not translating directly into construction. A euphemism perhaps on my part, usually where there's smoke, there's fire. I seem to be getting more calls about subdivision types of development. If I was saying this 6 months ago, it was more the R5 or the larger type of developments.
Okay. Thank you. Just a very, if I may. So my understanding is that any additional revenues or tax base resulting from increased construction of dwellings is not enough to offset increased capital or operational cost for our systems.
Correct. Okay. So yeah,
thank you.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, and again, to be a little bit repetitive, it's the fact that our reserves are not at market replacement value, and the fact that where we're seeing all this activity, the best thing we can do is to be prepared. And there's the added bonus that if we can be prepared, we're stimulating the local economy by putting these contracts out there.
Councillor Gates.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. With regards to PCAP funding, are we regulated by the URB as to what amounts we can allocate to sewer?
Thank you. So, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. So only water is regulated by the Nova Scotia Utility Review Board. So sewer would not be. So for us, it's, I feel like this is going to be, I'm over pushing here a little bit, but you don't want to start getting into a situation where your sewer bill is as much or more than your tax bill on the same piece of paper. So the decision about whether you're proceeding with this stuff, again, has to go back to get as much federal and provincial money as you can, have something that you have that you can use as a down payment to lessen your long-term debt, and then keep your long-term debt stable in terms of principal and interest. When payments come off the table, you're introducing new payments on the table. Then the combination of those things means that the $5.99 in sewer over a period of years is not going up by $20 and $30 and getting closer to what the actual property tax amount is on the bill, if that helps.
I guess my question was with regards to the sewer. Are we eligible to use PCAP for the sewer projects?
Thank you. So, Mr. Mayor, through you, yes. And for example, now we're at present day dealing with a project, as you're well aware, on Chapel Road in Canning. So typically, PCAP is a provincial program. That's typically a fairly small program. The province does have some larger programs, and we've been pretty good at picking up money through programs like investing in the Canada Infrastructure Program, ICIP. There's certainly other ones out there that are competitive programs. But since you opened the door, that's a really good point for me to jump in on another one. So we've recently, we think we're well positioned, for example, to pick up funding for another one of our very large projects. We're now down at the short list. But to get ready to the short list in a competitive program, you need tender-ready documents. So, I mean, when these programs are announced, you need to come out and say, I've got a roll of drawings, I've got the tender ready to post, we're ready to go. So that's what they're interested in, because the federal government, rightfully so, a lot of the times, and the provincial government, reference the federal government here in this instance, they're coming out with this program to stimulate the economy. So we need staff in place to get these projects that we've planned 5 years out. It's nice to have them 5 years out, but we need to have the roll of drawings, and we need to have the tender documents. I mean, if you're looking forward, what's the best way to deal with the impact of a tariff? Stimulate the local economy and spend on infrastructure. So we need to be ready with those drawings and tender packages to do that. And to do that is a good segue into my next presentation, talking about staffing levels.
And sorry, through you again, Mr. Mayor, some of those federal programs, are they not 100% funding if they're ready to go, shovel ready?
There was one, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, through you to the councillor. So there's one recent one that we're now on the short list for that the province has not signed a bilateral agreement, and that would be subject to 40%. So we would get 40% on that. So typically, if it's combined, as I know you're aware, with your background, you know, in the older days, it was 33, 33, 33. More recently, it was 40 from the feds, 33 from the province, and then 27 from the local level of government or other sources. So we obviously would like to take advantage of the 27 cents when we can, the 33 cents, but at this point in time, we would not leave 40 cents on the table would be my strong suggestion.
A quick comment, and listen to Director Javrick say less and less single-family dwellings. I know my background in the real estate industry for 40 years. You see some highs and then you see lows and highs and lows, and I think we've been on a big high because there's been housing shortages, and that's drove prices up, that's drove assessments up, and that drove taxes up, and that's drove rents up. I see the government has, I think, starting to put the brakes on other levels of government on immigration, and that will lessen the housing needs, which will lessen the housing costs. I know we're fortunate here, we're growing. Greenwood is growing, I think Canning is going to grow. But I do have a fear, Mr. CAO, that eventually we're going to have oversupply in the market, and I think hopefully not be overly confident that we're automatically going to get these assessment increases that's going to increase taxes, because it's quite possible that that housing market will change and actually go the other way. I think the influence of immigration has made a big difference, and if all of a sudden that stops, then there's not going to be the shortage, and that will put prices down. So are we keeping a good eye on that to make sure that you know, we're not over projecting down the road that we're going to get assessment increases, because we're fortunate Greenwood may be Canning, but other than that, I think the world economy is going to change, and not for the better. Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The only comment that I can think of is relative to our Housing Accelerator Fund. So in that particular program that we were awarded about 5.9 million to help stimulate, and it's basically, it's a different type of results type program where you actually have to report the number of permits that you issue, and we're at the level we said we were going to do now. But I mean, that could be a good gauge in terms of properly, planning and growth centers and projecting those levels. And then, if it's based on performance, hopefully the federal and provincial government are willing to contribute in places like Greenwood and Kingston to help meet if there's a supply need there.
Absolutely. But I do fear that property values are not going to keep rising.
I think you could very well be right in that regard.
Councillor Sappington.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, and with all due respect, I see all the time people wanting to move to the valley and desperate to move to the valley, whether they're students or they have a job, which is wonderful, except they can't find the housing. So I am excited about the fact that we are growing. I represent a growth center. What I am concerned about is actually on page 14, which is the census snapshot. And with the Acadia Pool closing, it has been eye-opening to me when people say they are now going to leave the valley because they no longer have the amenities that they need, whether it is the education that they're seeking, or whether they're on the swim team, or whether they're actually part of that group or the SMILE group, or you name it. And so for me, it was eye-opening for some people that would say it's just a pool. It was more than just a pool. So by seeing what we would lose by having lost that pool, that makes me go to what I'm about to say in regards to, right now we're talking about the bare necessities to have our municipality: water, sewer, but I feel compelled to say that another bare necessity is healthcare. And I was having coffee with someone the other day, and her husband, his job is to recruit people to areas from the healthcare industry. And they said that their first and foremost question when they're recruiting healthcare professionals is, what are the amenities that that municipality offers? Because there is an expectation of professionals for their own families. They want these amenities, and if a municipality can't offer that, then they go to a different municipality. And so when we look at what we offer as a municipality, I really think that we need to be deeply concerned about more than just the bare necessities, and how what we offer as a municipality will in turn, those are the people that are moving to the valley. And so I really compel you to look at page 14, take a look at the census snapshot, because I know that we will have people coming. We are the third largest municipality in Nova Scotia. Who's moving here? That would be my question. Thank you.
Good question. Mr. CAO.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and not to sound like doing a soft shoe dance up here, but I really think that's something for your debate section of the next meeting. I could give you personal opinions, but that's what it would be. So I think if your thoughts are that there should be more invested in that strategic bucket that we talked about, by all means, that's a strong debate point.
Okay, so are you ready to call Katrina up now,
I
or
have one more,
one more? Okay.
if you permit.
No,
So there's two sections that I was going to present. So the first one, again, brief recap, is what's the budget framework that you work under: balanced budgets, no long-term debt and operating, all the things we talked about with reserves and keeping your operating reserve in place. And the pitch, more or less, to say, do it on the assessment lift with this last year's rates, and then to have very modest increases to the sewer lot and vacant, or sewer dwelling unit and lot count amount that's applied to those counts. So my second presentation here deals with staffing. And staffing is one of these ones where I think it's a check and balance in the Municipal Government Act. So ultimately, you are the Board of Governance and you approve a budget. Once you approve a budget, administration, under Part 2 of the Act, establishes the departments of the municipality and adopts a system of classification positions. So that's a quick paraphrase here of Section 31. And so what we generally do coming in is to try to be transparent of what we're talking about. Although staffing falls to the administrative level, you approve the budget. So you can't do staffing unless there's an approved budget in place, and what do you need to know about that? So in this year's, as you'll notice through that document, there's 6 what we refer to as net new positions have been included in the proposed budget, and that would come with an approximate $450,000 cost. And what we're referring to here is these positions. The first one is a bylaw enforcement officer, and I'm just going to capture like 1 or 2 points on each of these, so happy to discuss them. So this is an increase, so there would be 2 bylaw enforcement officers. The second bylaw enforcement officer primarily would relate to land use bylaw related matters. So whether we're looking at someone, there's a complaint received about someone relative to a development agreement, for example. Those types of issues that we're just not, because of the level of activity keeping up with, that's what that position would focus on. Procurement assistant is that, you know, where we discussed here a couple of weeks ago, and there's more than this, there's operating procurement as well, but if we just stick to the capital procurement, we have proposed about a $48 million budget. So there's, as you can well imagine, there's lots of paperwork that goes with that in terms of the public disclosure and openings and all of those types of mechanical types of features that are so important that have to be attended to. A project engineer for engineering and public works, and I think what I would reference there, in my bias, Director Kerrigan may have other items to add to this, but it's really about getting these projects to that tender-ready state. So I think we've been really successful, if I could say it that way, in terms of attracting ICIP money and other programs, and it tends because we can get the applications ready. But I can see that being even more and more as the federal government tries to stimulate the economy. And with the amount of $48 million worth of capital projects, there's a significant amount of project management that has to happen as well. The next 2 I can kind of group together with treatment plant operator and industrial electricians. So in part, we're just point blank under-resourced. Things like vacations cause havoc in the organization. And the other item that's somewhat related to this is the fact that in those particular positions, we need a succession plan. We have an older workforce in place there. So we've been looking at models that we've put together, for example, in building inspectors, where we're trying to get people coming out of the Nova Scotia Community College not going into the trade but considering inspections to be an option. So in this particular one, maybe there's people out there who haven't really considered wastewater treatment or water treatment or an industrial electrician outside of the private sector, but starting a career in the public sector. So starting people out here and having them mentored for a period of time. An engagement specialist, as we've discussed off and on here, since your election, the municipality has an engagement policy, but does not have an engagement strategy. And as much as we are trying to get to that, we don't have the resource to do that, and that's something I think we hear about quite often. So primary first initial responsibility would be to lead and work with council in developing that strategy, and then second, falling out under that position would be to actually administer or coordinate engagement sessions. The Housing Initiative Coordinator is revenue neutral because that is right now being paid for by the CMHC program that I referenced a few minutes ago. And there's lots of responsibilities there, but I know I've had discussions with a couple of councillors. I think a real priority, we've already come in with a package to council talking about relief of permit fees, but there's so much more to do with that program in terms of getting the actual construction money, the $5.9 million out the door. So how do we structure that? What types of programs and offerings are we going to used to try to stimulate that type of activity. In-house legal counsel is a position that used to be here up until 2016. I'm not quite sure how long that position was here, but it was here a year before I had started. Other units, certainly they are a little larger than us. CBRM, for example, do have in-house legal counsel. This is, if you read the budget document, we're proposing, we had a budgeted director's position last year that wasn't filled, so we're not adding incrementally over last year's budget. If you do it a budget-to-budget comparison, we're not filling that director's position, but we're suggesting that that funding be used for in-house legal. And there was an administrative assistant that is not in that. So I think that if I go back to this, and so, you know, there's something to be said for history here, I guess, in some regards, but when I first started in municipal government, year over year, a lot of years you didn't see a lot of difference. You know, it was, I'm doing this year what I basically did last year, and it's not like that anymore. And there's things at play like labor market conditions, and though we want to hire people, sometimes we can't find those positions, and we have to be somewhat nimble to figure out how we do service delivery and go in a slightly different way. So that's, I think, why the Act is set up where you approve the budget, but then administration has some discretion to work, as long as we work within that budget envelope, but we need some type of flexibility. You know, can we hire an in-house counsel with the money we have to offer? I don't know. So we'll find out if you approve that and we go to market. Is there any interest in coming to work here as an industrial electrician? You know, so we'll assess that out when we go through that type of thing. Anyway, for transparency, I just wanted to make sure that you were aware. I know it's in the budget document. It's in more detail than this, but we're talking about 6 net new positions. That has an approximate cost in that budget of $450,000. The one from the CMHC is neutral because we're getting third-party money, and the in-house counsel position is not incremental in terms of budget to budget because we're just not filling a director's position that was unfilled last year. But again, happy to take any questions you may have.
Any question to CAO on that? Okay. Councillor Sappington.
With all due respect, through you, Mayor, is it safe to assume the legal costs that we have spent from using out-of-house legal services would be much higher than having in-house legal?
That's Mr. Mayor, through you to Councillor Sappington, that's a really good question. And I cannot stand here in front of you. This is not a replacement, and I should have mentioned that, for external counsel. So legal counsel are akin to some degree accountants, and some even probably more degree to engineers. So for example, an engineer, you have an electrical engineer, you have a mechanical engineer, you have a structural, civil, so on and so forth. Lawyers now, you have HR specialists. You have specialists that do with municipal planning, land use related matters. So we are presently now, our external counsels with McGuinness Cooper. I really don't see a lot of change to that relationship with McGuinness Cooper. So what we're proposing here and what's written up in the document is that this position would do work in insurance related matters and risk related matters and also internal contracts. So we're finding that we have, without embellishment, on a weekly basis, we're dealing with one of our villages, with one of our towns, with one of our sister municipalities, towns here, or with constituents that are asking things that I don't believe we need to go to external counsel for, and then we could be a lot more efficient if we could turn it around in-house.
Okay. Don't see anybody else, Mr. CAO, so carry on.
Thank you. I think my time is done. Sorry.
Good morning, Katrina.
Good morning.
You had all the bad news, so you're coming with the good news,
Well,
right?
I do have quite a few slides, so. Thank you, Scott. So you'll see that the items Scott covered come up again as we make our way through the operating budget detail. But before that, I'm going to take you through some high-level points on the budget. So the proposed budget includes total expenditures of $69.8 million, which is a 6.9% increase over the prior year. And some key variances include a $2.1 million increase in mandatory payments, so 7.8%. Mandatory payments already make up 42% of our budget, so they're another 7.8% on top. Salary and benefit increases, including new positions, are totaling just over $1.4 million. And then special project increases total a little over $400,000. And these special projects would have been detailed within the capital budget that you've seen 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago with Director Barr. Can you see? Sorry. There's also increased grant programs of over $1.1 million. Most of this is attributable to the new FICE program, which I'll discuss when we get there. And then we have debt and reserve transfers, which are decreasing by $1.8 million this year. So some of our debt and reserve transfers are coming down. So along with being a budget, the document attached to the agenda acts as an operational plan and overview and does include things like departmental responsibilities, organizational charts, key projects, and many other details about the municipal operations. But due to time constraints of today's meeting, I'll be focusing primarily on the figures of the budget. But if there are questions on any of the aspects of the document, please let me know. So all of the charts are in your agenda packages. If some of the screens are kind of hard to see, you can follow along in the package. So we'll start to dig into more of the detail, and we'll start with the top half of the budget with our revenue. So we have total revenue of just over $69.8 million, and you can see this beginning on page 37 of the agenda package. As you can see, the municipality's general operations have 6 revenue streams, with the most significant being property tax, which makes up 76% of our total budget. And the following slides will provide additional details on each of these streams. So we'll start with property tax, which is budgeted at just over $53 million and is made up of residential, commercial, resource, farm property acreage, and special tax arrangement. The proposed budget contains $3.67 million of additional tax revenue, which is the result of property assessment growth with no proposed change to the municipality's tax rates. And we'll go into more detail on assessment growth and trends later in the presentation. Next, we have our payments in lieu of taxes, which we refer to as the PILT. This can be seen on page 39 of the agenda package, and PILT funds are collected on provincially and federally owned properties within the municipality. So it's sort of, instead of charging property tax on those, we get grant funds from the provincial and federal government. The 25-26 budget has decreased by 8.4%, which relates to updated property information and adjustments made primarily at the federal government level related to their properties. We also have a decrease to the HST offset grant, which is based on a 3-year average, which has been trending downwards. Next, we have our interest revenue. So this is revenue earned on both overdue accounts and on our bank balances. So interest on overdue accounts is forecast to be growing in 25-26 just based on historical trends. And then our bank account interest is budgeted based on average bank balances and published rate assumptions, with decreases throughout the year to the Bank of Canada rate being factored into the calculation for 25-26. So when we look at the budget for this year, we realize that the Bank of Canada rate may not be as strong as we've seen in the past 2 years, so we have factored that into our budget projections. Next, we have our departmental revenues. So departmental revenues are generated through sales of services, services provided to other governments, and grant funding. And a combination of historic averages, planned activity, and other known or estimated inputs are used to develop these budgets. Departmental revenues are budgeted to increase by 9.2%, with sewer revenues playing a large part of that increase, along with Housing Accelerator grant funds and some recreation programming revenue. Revenues by individual departments will be discussed later along with each department's budget. And just for reference, for instance, the sewer revenue is adding $320,000 to the departmental revenue budget. The housing accelerator funds are adding $152,000. So those are really the two main big drivers. So before moving on to the expenditure side of the budget, I'd just like to loop back to cover some of the property tax related information and trends that we've been seeing. And this material can be seen on page 41 of the agenda package. So the slide in front of you details the municipality's various tax rates, which are unchanged within the proposed budget. And the next chart details the impact of 1 cent residential and commercial tax rate adjustments would have on revenue. So as Scott mentioned before, on an average residential assessment tax bill, they would see a savings of about $20 or an increase of about $20 if you change the rate by a penny. The impact on the overall budget, though, 1 penny change would have a $481,000 impact on the overall budget. And then if you did the same for commercial, you would see a $45,000 change. Next, we have property tax revenue, which is calculated based on current year assessments and the proposed tax rate. With a small allowance for appeals, people are able to appeal through PVSD throughout the year for their assessed values. So growth in residential assessments stands to be the most significant contributor to the increase in revenues. And this chart on this slide, which is figure 10 on page 42 of the agenda, demonstrates revenue growth for each class of property over the last 5 years. And all increases are the result of assessment growth only. As detailed in the table on the right, over the past 5 years, residential revenue has grown 42.6%, with 7% of that growth captured in the 25-26 year. Commercial revenue has grown 19.3% over the 5 years, and resource has kept pace with residential at 48.5%. So we have seen significant assessment increase over the past 5 years, and as you can see, it sort of peaked in 23, 24, and that sort of aligns with what we're seeing with trending and what Mayor Corkum had mentioned about potentially having the real estate market pull back a little bit. Next, we have our uniform assessment growth. So uniform assessment, which is often abbreviated to just UA, is the municipality's total taxable property assessment as calculated by the province. So all of the assessment groups on the previous slide, plus an additional amount based on the value of funds received through special property tax arrangements. Uniform assessment is a driving factor for several cost-sharing agreements, such as the education amount is the primary driver of that contribution. Grants and mandatory provincial expenses. The chart on this slide, which is figure 11 on page 43 of the agenda, compares the historical change in uniform assessment for the municipality compared to other rural Nova Scotian municipalities and then the province as a whole. So the municipality has 8.7% growth in uniform assessment factored into the budget for 25-26, but information for the other rural municipalities isn't available yet, so we don't have the 25-26 figures there for them. And again, as Scott mentioned earlier, the uniform assessment is based on a 1-year lag of assessment. So if we have a really strong assessment year, for instance, you might not see education go up in relation to that, but you will see it the next year, even if our assessment drops back down. And I just want to mention, if anybody has questions throughout, just let me know, or if I'm going too fast. So now looking specifically at residential assessment, the 7% increase referenced on the previous slide is detailed along with a 5-year history split between the cap growth and the non-cap growth. And this is figure 12 on page 44 of the agenda. So Nova Scotia capped assessment program legislation places an upper limit on the annual increase for residential property assessments as long as that property hasn't changed hands or undergone a major renovation. So the cap is based on the Nova Scotia October CPI and applies to all residential properties unless they were purchased or had a major renovation. This chart distinguishes the cap portion of assessment growth from growth through property sales, new construction, and major renovations. And for 25-26, the increase in capped assessment is only 1.5%, and that is the lowest it's been in 4 years, which, if they are successful in maintaining the inflation sort of rate that they want to maintain, we would see that this comes back into historical levels, the capped rate. Next, we have commercial assessment, and this chart is on the slide, is figure 14 on page 46 of the agenda. And this details that there is a 2.4% commercial assessment decrease, along with a 5-year history of commercial assessments. So unlike residential, commercial properties are not subject to cap legislation. It's sort of, assessment is based on sort of market value as well as income generated. So following a significant increase in the commercial assessment rule in 23-24, the 25 rule has decreased by $11 million, or 2.4%. And almost half of all commercial accounts saw decreases in their assessed values for 25, with a combined reduction in assessed value of $26.7 million. So more than 2/3 of these reductions, $18.6 million in total, were from accounts that were assessed at a value greater than $1 million. So the bulk of it is coming from the larger commercial properties. A group of 75 accounts that represents just over half of the total commercial assessed value. So on our tax roll, we've got 75 properties assessed at over $1 million, and they'd make up half of our commercial assessment. So these declines in assessed value were partially offset by the combined $10 million increase in assessed value attributable to other accounts on the roll. And then 19 commercial accounts were removed in the 2025 roll, representing $2 million in assessed value. But it was offset by the addition of 18 new commercial assessment accounts with a combined assessed value of $2.5 million. So as you can see, we've sort of taken a deeper dive into the commercial assessment just to make sure that we're understanding what is driving this decline and what kind of trend we might be seeing for the future. Next, we're going to discuss some property tax rates. So property assessment is one component of the tax formula, and now we'll look at the other. The municipality's residential and commercial tax rates, and we'll start with residential. So this chart, which is figure 16 on page 49 of the agenda, compares the tax rate plus applicable area rates for properties in various areas of the municipality as well as the 3 local towns. And I would just comment that within the book, there is also another chart that compares us on a provincial level, but we want to sort of zone in for today's presentation on sort of what we're seeing locally. So as you can see, Kings Rural would be the lowest rate, so that would be without the village area rates, without a fire rate. And then we've got all of our villages or growth centers and then the 3 towns. So as you can see, the municipality's residential tax rate is below each of the neighboring towns and is also 13.4 cents below the average rate for other rural municipalities. So those municipalities that would be more rural in nature across the province. And this can be seen on page 48 of the agenda. Next, we have a measure that the province calculates annually, and this is residential tax effort. Residential tax effort is a measure of the ability of a household to sort of afford its taxes, and is a calculation of tax and sewer rate revenue per dwelling unit as a percentage of the municipality's median income. So how much of a person's income does it take to service their property tax bill? So a higher percentage would indicate that the property owners are directing a higher portion of their income towards paying property taxes, which may mean that we would have less room to adjust rates if that was the case. And the province considers residential tax effort below 4% as to be healthy. The municipality is currently at 1.9%, which is below the rural average and well within the provincial threshold. This measure has seen little change over the past number of years, indicating that incomes appear to be keeping pace with assessment increases. Residential tax affordability would be a concern if this indicator was growing. Next, we'll look at the commercial tax rate, which at 2.287 is also lower than the 3 local towns, but it is above the rural municipal average of 2.1. This chart on the slide shows the rate comparison through the various areas of the municipality, so the towns and the villages. And it should be noted that the municipality has a single sizable commercial account that makes up over 13.5% of commercial assessment base. So the highest assessed 5% of commercial accounts generate more than 52% of the municipality's commercial tax revenue. Therefore, any adjustments to the commercial tax rate would most significantly impact these larger enterprises. So five assessment accounts make up over 52% of your commercial base. So now, with the revenues sort of gone through, we'll move over to the operating expenditures. And this begins on page 53 of your agenda package. And this pie chart just shows the percentage allocated of each dollar of revenue. So where does each dollar go? So you see that for each dollar, 24 cents goes to education, 15 to salaries, 14 to RCMP and prosecution, and so forth. And the expenses have been broken down by department, which I'm going to go through now. So the first group of expenditures we'll look at are the mandatory payments, which are detailed starting on page 55 of the agenda. So mandatory payments are items that the municipality has no discretion over and form the single largest group of expenditures within the budget. So these expenditures, not only do we have no discretion to pay, but we also have no discretion in how they are calculated. So the education amount has increased 9.4% based on changes to uniform assessment and student enrollment, with the 25-26 increase tied to the higher assessment growth that we have seen in 23-24 and 24-25. The one-year leg, again, of the uniform assessment is coming into play here. So we may see this sort of flatten out in the next few years, but it's not going to decrease. The RCMP amount is estimated to increase 6.5% based on historic trends. The RCMP Department of Justice were not able to confirm the exact amount of increase before this budget was prepared and finalized, but they did indicate that our assumptions are within the correct range. So we don't have an exact figure, but they have indicated that we're sort of in the range of where it would be. And then regarding the regional library, the province approved a funding model effective for fiscal 21-22, with contributions remaining constant for 5 years, which would have ended in fiscal 24-25. The regional library funding has not yet been finalized under a new agreement. However, the municipality has built in a 5% increase for estimated budget purposes in case there is additional funding requirements there. So next we have our intermunicipal service agreements, the municipal corporations, and the 2 largest ones you would have had individual budget presentations on. The IMSAs start on page 58 of the agenda, and again, the 2 largest are obviously Valley Waste and King's Transit. The municipality's contribution to Valley Waste has increased 9.5% in 25-26 to just over $5.5 million. Key budget influences included the rising cost of major contracts, landfill diversion credits, and salary increases. Again, budget details were presented at the January 21st, 2025 Committee of the Whole meeting. And with Valley Waste, prior year surplus funds that had been held in reserve, totaling $873,000, are being utilized in 25-26 to partially fund the Valley Waste contribution. So we are pulling a little bit out of our reserves that we set aside to fund the increase in the Valley Waste. And these reserve funds were designated in the Valley Waste Reserve, so for that purpose. And then we've got the municipality's contribution to King's Transit, which has increased 12.9% to just over $1.2 million. And here the key budget influences included increase to route operations and fleet maintenance. And again, budget details were presented at the January 21st, 2025 Committee of the Whole meeting. Along with Valley Waste and King's Transit, we also do make contributions to the Valley Community Fiber Network, which is seeing a slight decrease for next year. the Valley Regional Enterprise Network, which is expected to remain stable, and then our Regional Emergency Management Organization, which has a slight increase. Now we'll start in sort of on our more internal departments. So the legislative budget section begins on page 61 of the agenda. And budgeted expenditures include counselor remuneration, travel, meals, committee honorariums, scholarships, and other legislative services. So you'll see salaries and benefits are budgeted to increase 12.5%. This is based on Policy Finance 05002, Council and Committee remuneration. An increase in salary levels came into effect with the new council, so therefore the 25-26 budget includes a full year at this higher rate, whereas the 24-25 budget would have been split with the old and the new council. So materials, supplies, and utilities include committee costs such as citizen honorariums and meeting costs, membership dues, council travel and conference costs, telephone and office supplies. And budgeted amounts are intended to reflect actual usage throughout 25-26. And you'll see under purchase services, there was $197,000 last year. That would have been the election cost, so that's why it's not in this year. Next, we'll have the administration department, which begins on page 64 of the agenda. So the administrative department would be the office of the CAO and the deputy CAO. And this department has a total tax levy requirement of $4.1 million, which consists of, on the revenue side, this would include revenue generated from recreation programs such as aquatics, day camp, and seniors programming. Recreation would fall under the deputy CAO. Grants represent funding received from other levels of government, again for recreation programming, summer student positions, and the budget amounts reflect anticipated available funds for planned programming. So the transfer from other funds would include carry forward reserve transfers for ongoing projects. So all of the special projects you'll see are grouped here under this department as they're sort of under the purview of the CAO. And this transfer from other funds would be the reserve funds that are funding a portion of these projects and primarily related to funds that have carried over from other years. On the expenditure side, salaries and benefits are increasing with 2 positions added to this department, the engagement specialist and the in-house legal counsel. So the in-house legal counsel is reallocated salary from another department, which had a director salary level budgeted last year that was not filled. And again, the following is going to be true across all departments, so I'll highlight it now, and then I won't mention it for the other departments. But basically, salaries also included in the salary and benefits budget are non-union rate increases set out in policy HR 06019, and then potential or planned unionized increases per the collective agreement, along with an allowance for vacant positions. So our materials, supplies, and utilities include in this department are travel, telephone, public engagement initiatives, office supplies, recreation programming would be a significant portion, and then costs related to occupational health and safety. And these budget accounts are reviewed annually and adjusted to be in line with actual spending and projects for the upcoming year. Purchase services would be heavy in this department because they would include consulting, insurance, legal fees, training for all staff, recruiting, document storage, advertising, and again, recreation programming. Adjustments have been made to bring budget amounts in line with actual spending. Legal fees are increasing slightly based on historic trends and current pricing. The training budget is decreasing based on what we've been seeing lately with participation at training courses. And then we have the special projects, which I'll detail on the next slide and which have already been presented as part of the capital budget. Debt and reserve transfers are increasing slightly, and these represent contributions to the IT capital reserve. For each person, a small amount is put into the IT capital reserve each year so that we always have money to replace laptops and whatnot. as well as a contribution to the election reserve so that we'll have the money in 4 years to pay for the next election. So again, this chart is within the budget book, and this just details all of the special projects which would have been already presented by Director Barr. This is just the operating side of them, so this is the amount coming from operations to fund each of these projects. And you can see I've broken it down between operating reserves and then sort of new money, which would be the tax rate. So this is what's drawing from the tax rate this year, which is just over $380,000 for a total of $2.8 million going towards special projects from the operations themselves. Next, we have Finance and IT, which begins on page 76 of the agenda. And this has a net tax levy requirement of $4.1 million. However, $1.14 million of this are those enhanced reserve contributions that Scott has mentioned and that I'll talk a little bit. So when we started to see the assessment lift go up 2 years ago, to be proactive and because we didn't know how long that would last or what that would do, we took the measure of using that opportunity to sort of enhance our reserves. And so for the past 2 years, we've been putting extra money in the reserves. This year, it's a little bit lower than what we had last year. So last year, we were able to put $2.9 million. This year, we're just at 1.1 with the lower assessment lift. And also in the grant section, we have a new capital grant for villages, which is $1 million of new money, which sort of, we're giving them $1 million of capital money that would have otherwise come from our capital reserve. So it's in a different place, but it's sort of the same idea. So then revenues within this department would include activity revenue and other revenue. So activity revenue includes commissions charged for the collection of area rates. We charge 4% to administer the area rates for fire departments, villages, recreation groups, things like that. And then we also do have administration fees for the provision of payroll and IT services as a means to fully recover costs such as staff time, supplies, software licensing, and overhead associated with these services. On the expense side, we have salaries and benefits increasing 12.4%. This department does have one new staff member, would be the procurement assistant. Within this department, materials, supplies, and utilities would include things like telephone, postage, office supplies. And then we have our software supplies and our hardware supplies, which are a big part of this. And then toner to service all of the printers. The purchase services would include tax sale expenses, which are primarily related to legal costs and are recovered through the tax sale administration fees. We have our external audit fees here, our equipment contracts, as well as IT consulting, which has been increasing in line with contract requirements. So licensing and maintenance contracts within the IT division budget is the primary driver of these two categories increasing. An additional amount has been budgeted for rising fees for our existing software, as well as new required software licenses. So increase in purchase services, again, are primarily related to these items. And in the budget document itself, it details sort of some of the programs that we're looking to implement. So a human resource software, asset management software, new accounting software, all of those things. Next, we have engineering and public works with a budget of just over $3.6 million and an increase of 3.4%. So this would not include our sewer. This would just be the engineering and public works department. And this can be seen on page 84 of the agenda. On the revenue side, we have streetlight area rate revenue from the municipal complex, some solar panel power purchase agreement revenue. We also have the administrative fees that we charge to the utilities for and service areas. And the increase here does primarily relate to those administrative fees that we charge to the utilities in relation to support services provided by the municipality. So for each of our 3 utilities, we do charge an administrative fee to cover sort of the supervisory, the supplies, the software licensing, things like that, debt service on the buildings. So that's sort of what's increasing here within this group. And then we have our transfers to reserve, from reserve. And this is relates primarily to the payment to the Government of Canada lease out in Greenwood for the air park. There is a specific reserve to fund that each year. Salaries and benefits have a 4.1% decrease because of the reallocation of the one director level position to the administrative department. So this is the department that the unfilled director would have been in last year. Material, supplies, and utilities include the municipal complex maintenance, supplies, power, water, maintenance and utilities for the park facilities, Aylesford Lake and other parks, supplies and vehicles to support the municipal staff. And these budgets reflect actual and planned usage, with maintenance and power accounts primarily driving the increases here. Purchase services would include contracted services for janitorial, snow clearing, engineering consulting fees, lifeguard services, and our J-class road paving budget. The increase here relates primarily to the J-class road paving, for which the budget is based on the council-approved priority list, along with an estimated cost per kilometer. And another key driver of the increase is some enhanced trail maintenance, with an addition of funds for enhanced trail maintenance that in part was previously funded through the grant stream with funding to the Annapolis Valley Trails Coalition. It's anticipated to end or be scaled back in 2025-26, and then these increases are offset by the decrease in climate-related consulting. So here we are adding some money for servicing the trails internally, because previously we had an agreement with the Trails Coalition, which is ending, and we'll have to take some of that work internally. Transfers to reserve and debt service have increased by 6.6%, and this budget is based on the actual depreciation rates of related department capital assets. So this department would sort of house our transfer to depreciation reserves for sidewalks and roads. Next, we have our streetlight rates. Within the EPW budget are the costs and revenue associated with streetlights, so shown on page 93 of the agenda package. An annual fee is charged to properties located within 100 feet of a service streetlight area. The fee is set on a cost recovery basis and used only to fund those costs directly related to providing the lighting. And this amount is set out under Fees Policy Finance 05003. And just to highlight that the fee for the general rate is dropping from $43 to $42, so not a big change. And this directly correlates with power rates and the number of properties within the district. So if there's more properties that are sort of sharing the burden of the increased power rates. So just a small adjustment there. Next, we have our Emergency Management and Fire Protection Department, which is just over $3.2 million. And this can be found on page 95 of the agenda. So on the revenue side, grants would include things such as funds received from the province for civic addressing programs. Salaries would include the emergency management coordinator and a portion of management salaries. Purchase services would include fire dispatch costs, generator and dry hydrant funding, which is provided to community groups, and then some emergency funding if there was ever the need. Fire department funding will be broken down on the next slide. So the municipality funds 13 fire departments, and operational funding is provided through the general tax rate, while capital funding is provided through specific area rates of that area that is serviced by the department. But the actual operating funding for each of the departments comes from the general tax pool. Through consultation with the Fire Services Advisory Committee, which is a standing committee of council, the advice is provided on fire services, and more recently, Municipal Council approved the Fire and Emergency Services Providers funding policy that will see each fire department enter a contract. So as you can see, we sort of have it broken down by those who do not have a contract currently, and then the 4 that do currently have a contract, with the goal being that everybody would have a contract. So those departments with contracts have submitted budgets within the terms of those agreements, and 2 departments, you can see Berwick and Hansport, have requested additional funds beyond the contract maximum, and this is due to escalating costs over the past several years in service delivery. Both departments have submitted a letter outlining the requested additional funds, and this, along with the calculations, will be provided with your deliberation materials coming out this week, and which will be part of next week's meeting. As you can see, the contract or the non-contract departments, a motion was passed that they would be at 1.5%, which is in line with the October CPI, which is also the capped amount. Next, we have our Planning Services Department. So the Land Use and Planning and Development budget begins on page 93 of the agenda. And for 24-25, there has been some reorganization of staff and accounts between the Planning Department and the Development Services Department. So you'll see those on the tables. In addition to the regular salary and benefit increases, there is also the reallocation of a half position into this department away from the Development Department. So some small adjustments within the departments. Material, supplies, and utilities include telephone and supplies, and those budgets are adjusted actually to reflect the actual anticipated cost based on what we've been seeing. And there's also been $5,000 added to the supply account to facilitate signage requirements. Purchase services includes consulting and meeting costs. Next, we have our building enforcement, which has a budget of just under $1.4 million, and this is seen on page 104 of the agenda. So this division would be your sort of building and fire inspectors and your bylaw officers. And it has a net budget of just over $1.38 million. Activity revenue here would include building permit revenue, amounts received from other municipal units for inspection services to cost recover our costs, village contributions to the Joint Accessibility Advisory Committee, dog tag revenue, and some other smaller license and permanent fees. Beyond the regular increases in salary and benefits, the additional bylaw officer would be grouped in this department. So materials, supplies, and utilities would include telephone, travel, which would be all of the vehicle fleet maintenance for this division, and office supplies. And again, costs have been adjusted to better reflect actual and anticipated needs. Purchase services relates primarily to an animal control contract with an external service provider, which has increased as part of the annual 5-year service agreement. So they have a contract with this organization to provide the service, and the budget just reflects the sort of the cost escalation built into that contract. Next, we have development services. So this would be the newly added development services budget, beginning on page 105 of the agenda. This new division was created in 24-25 and has been enhanced in 25-26 with the reallocation of the development staff. So activity revenue here would include permit and development application fees, and the budget is based on historical trends and anticipated activity within that area. Grant funding relates to funds received under the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund. So this would be the operational portion of that grant funding. And it will be utilized to fund the Housing Accelerator position, along with related costs to support that position, as well as funding to offset the loss of revenue related to permit fees being waived to encourage housing development per policy finance 05003 fees. So the $49,000 sort of under purchase services would be our cost estimate of what it would cost to waive the fees. The Development Services Department did bring a presentation earlier this year to you on that subject. So this is just sort of the reflection of that cost. Beyond the regular increase in salary and benefits here, you'll see a Housing Accelerator Coordinator position has been added to this department. And again, this funding would be 100% from the grant stream, the HAF grant stream. Material, supplies, and utilities would just include telephone, travel, office supplies. And again, the costs are just adjusted based on actual cost estimates and anticipated needs. And again, with the main increase here coming from supporting the new position, which a portion of these costs would be also offset by the HAF program. So debt and transfers to reserves represent amounts, again, to contribute to the IT capital reserve. So a small amount so that everybody gets a new laptop when they need it. We have the money.
Okay, I think what I'm gonna do is stop you right there,
Yep.
Katrina, and we'll take a 10-minute break, and before we get into the next phase, which would be grants, which is kind of separate from
Yep.
some of the other stuff that you've put us through, so, and give us a chance to digest some of the information that you've got, and then we'll come back at it, okay? So, got 10 minutes. Enjoy. doing great, Katrina. Haven't got much more to do. Huh?
Not much, it's almost over. All right, so if everyone's ready, we'll start with the grant program. So this is the money that we fund into the community and into different streams. And this can be seen on page 108 of the agenda package. So in 25-26, the grant program budget crosses the not-for-profit, okay, sorry. In 25-26, the budget crosses the $4.1 million mark with a 38.3% increase over prior year funding. I'm not going to go into the specifics of each individual program stream. Those are all detailed within the body of the book. And there's also a description of each of those within the body of the book. But I'm going to highlight sort of those programs that have significant budget changes this year. So we'll start with our property tax reductions. So the property tax reductions provides the personal property tax exemption to those households who have an income below a certain threshold. We provide them funding. So for this year, the income threshold would be increasing by $1,000 to $47,000, and then the maximum exemption amount has increased to $580, so a $20 increase there. A fairly generous program compared to other areas and other municipalities. The total budget has decreased, though, for the program, and this is based on the number of anticipated applications. So based on current and projected application volumes, the 25-26 budget is based on anticipated 1,530 applications. Last year, or the year before, we had increased this beyond the normal percentage every year increase. And anticipation of that, we had built in a few extra applications, anticipating it would generate the volume. So this budget is sort of pulling it back to where we're actually seeing the volume of applications coming in at. And then budgets for the individual grant programs. So then we also, within this area, we have not-for-profit property tax exemptions, and then we have our daycare property tax exemptions. So overall, we have a 9% increase in the proposed budget for property tax reduction funding. So for community enhancement grants, the budget for the counselor grants to organization streams has been indexed in line with the annual consumer price index going back for the past 7 years, resulting in a cumulative 23.9% increase. So under the community enhancement grants, the driver of that increase is really the increase to your personal or your individual counselor grants to organizations. We've gone back and said, what would that have been if it had kept pace with inflation over the past few years? So we're increasing that. Next, we have a new program under infrastructure programs. This is a program that will provide support to villages, infrastructure projects, and it's being introduced, which is designed to replace the current allocation of funds from the Federal Community Building Fund, CCBF. The FICE program, as we're calling it, would have been presented to council and approved as a new project. And basically the objective of the program would be to provide fair and equitable funding while also reducing the administrative burden and providing constant and predictable funding to the villages. So the goal of this program is to sort of replace what we would have been giving them in CCBF funding, and this will enable them to, number one, use it to stack with other federal programs, and then also will have less of an administrative burden internally with the CCBF reporting function. So this adds $1,050,000 to, or $1,050,000 to the grant budget. Other grant programs have an adjustment, such as things like the crossing guard funding, in line with actual amounts dispersed, and the reallocation here of the graduate assistant program, which provides funding for things like safe grad celebrations to the local high schools. It's just a reallocation, so you'll see that growing here. And finally, there have been some changes to the funding to external organization, external service providers. There is a chart in your book which sort of lists them out. So we provide funding to Valley Search and Rescue, Kings Point to Point Transit, Alternative Transit Society, King's Historical Society is being added this year, things like that. So those are all detailed within the budget, and we are seeing a decrease here, which is attributable to the pullback from the Annapolis Valley Trails Coalition. So that sort of covers the grants. Again, 38.3% increase. However, the bulk of that is coming from the $1 million being added to the infrastructure program. Next, I'm going to go through the municipal sewer operating budget, which is just over $5.8 million. And this starts on page 118 of the agenda package. So the municipal sewer provides services to properties in 18 different communities throughout the municipality. And it is accounted for within the general operating fund, but it's a separate set of accounts. So it doesn't have its own fund like regional sewer would, but it does have its own set of accounts, and they are self-balancing. So again, sewer revenue, sewer expenses, they must equal. Activity revenue, which includes residential, commercial, and other sources, are increasing by 5.9%. So in addition to the small rate escalation in line with Nova Scotia October CPI, so the 1.5% increase, there were also approximately 298 additional connections added to the system, and that's really what's driving the revenue increase, as well as increases to we have a few sales of service agreements with external parties, which are tied to specific costs, so a cost recovery fee basically to some larger customers, which are also increasing just in line with costs. Transfers from the sewer operating reserve, this relates to the carryover funds for the laboratory building assessment program, which is one of the projects that would have been discussed as part of the capital budget. And then moving into the expenditures, so beyond the regular increases in salary and benefits, we do have the two positions added here, the industrial electrician and the treatment plant operator. And these are to be shared amongst the three utilities, so the full cost of the two positions isn't captured within municipal sewer. It would be spread between water and regional sewer as well, but the bulk of it would be here. The maintenance and vehicle budgets would represent the best estimate of annual requirements and activity levels, and they're based on a review of historic spending, inflationary indexing, and planned upcoming sort of more non-routine maintenance projects. So all of that is discussed at the department level. I meet with everybody, and we sort of go over what we anticipate the needs for the coming year would be. Lift station and treatment plant power increases are primarily driven by rising power rates. The budget incorporates a combined 14.1%, which is based on the larger increase that was seen in 2024 calendar year, and then the smaller increase that we're seeing in 2025 calendar year. So it's sort of a combination of the two. Along with increased consumption at some locations due to equipment upgrades and changes. And additionally, the cost of disposal services has increased for some of our sludge disposal based on updated contract pricing. So that would also be sort of grouped in with the lift station and treatment plant power and servicing costs, as well as the service fee paid to regional sewer. So when we get to the regional sewer budget, you'll see that one of their revenue line items is a contribution from Kings, a service fee, and that would be reflected as an expense in this group of expenses on the municipal sewer side. So administrative costs would be the next sort of group, and those would include liability insurance, overhead supplies, training specific to our treatment plant operators and our sort of our EPW crew, clothing allowances, safety clothing, things like that, our laboratory and related expenses, telephone, as well. Here we have an administrative fee for services, which is provided to the municipality. So the sewer sort of pays a fee back to the municipality for, Director Kerrigan's time, my time, things like that. And that would be sort of the activity revenue that you saw a few slides back under the Public Works Department. So this is sort of where that revenue would be expensed. And then the decrease in the administrative costs, the 3.1% drop, is driven by a decrease in project-related consulting costs. So those projects have come to an end in 24-25, so they're not carrying over. So you're seeing a small decrease in the sort of the consultant portion of this budget. Transfers to reserve accounts for 22% of the budget. And these transfers are required to ensure funds will be available for future capital requirements and to smooth the impact on future rates, as well as debt servicing. So One of the debentures has matured, so you'll see there's a decrease in this line. And then also the amount contributed to reserves is tied to inflation and then, or tied to depreciation for the vehicles and things that are directly related to the sewer. And then basically whatever's left we put into the sewer capital reserve. So that's sort of the municipal sewer budget snapshot. And again, it has a 4.7% increase over the prior year budget. And as Scott mentioned in his earlier slides, we are seeing modest increases to the per dwelling and the vacant lot sewer fee charge. So this is the annual charge that people would see on their tax bills. Next, we have our regional sewer budget. So this would be the collection system and the treatment plant that flows into the big plant in New Minas. And this can be found on page 122 of the agenda package. So again, the regional sewer system would consist of the treatment plant in New Minas, as well as the trunk collection system, which extends from Colebrook to the New Minas-Greenwich border and from parts of North Kemptville. The regional sewer system is a partnership amongst the municipality, the town of Kemptville, the villages of New Minas, and PepsiCo, which is a private company. And the budget has been presented to the Regional Sewer Committee on March 13th, and they will meet again on April 1st to deliberate and either approve or deliberate the budget. Overall budget costs of the regional sewer system would have been presented in detail to them, but they are increasing 36.2%. Salaries and benefits, 15.1%. This would be their share of the allocation of public work staff. Each year this is adjusted based on the historic timesheets for the past 3 years. So if our staff are spending more time there, a higher percentage of the salaries are allocated there, as well as this would pick up a small portion or a portion of the 2 new positions. Material, supplies, and utilities, they have a 13.5% increase, which is related to maintenance and rising electricity rates, as well as rising electricity consumption. And the budget also includes an 80.1% increase for debt and reserve transfers. And this is driven by the debt service costs associated with recent and ongoing significant capital projects. So you can see here that the impact of the capital budget is really what's driving, the main driving factor here for the increase in expenses. So again, the regional sewer is funded through 4 partners. We are 16.4%, and this chart just shows the 24-25 contributions by partner, and then the 25-26 proposed contributions by partner. So you can see we would have $447,910, which would be expensed through the municipal sewer system. So that's our share of the regional sewer. Next, we have the Greenwood Water Utility, which I'm happy to say is the last major area. And you can find this beginning on page 124 of the agenda. So I'll just note a few figures on the slide have adjusted slightly from the book. There were just some few last minute changes, nothing material or significant, but just in case there's any confusion. The Greenwood Water Utility is a regulated utility under the Public Utilities Act. The utilities rates can only be changed through the approval of the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board. So we can't change the rates through the budget process. That would have to go to the UARB. Activity revenue is projected based on existing customer base, expected new connections based on historic, sort of what we've seen historically with growth patterns there, and then historic consumption levels. Other revenue represents interest earned on the utilities bank accounts. Salaries and benefits, similar to regional and municipal sewer, are seeing increases based on the allocation of the 2 new positions, as well as increases in allocation based on the time spent at the utility. Material, supplies, and utilities would include such as power, chemicals, maintenance, vehicles, and the budgets are based on estimates of annual requirements and activity levels with an inflationary index and planned upcoming maintenance projects. This utility didn't really have any standout extra significant areas in this, everything's kind of just going up with inflation and what we've been seeing. Purchase services include insurance, regulatory expenses, and water testing. So some of the regulatory expenses were required on a sort of schedule of years to do certain water testing, sort of compliance reports. So that would be built into this area. And we're seeing a small increase, which is reflect anticipated costs related to water testing. We have been seeing those trending up. There is no projected change to the rates for the upcoming year. However, it should be noted that with the level of capital spending being taking part in Greenwood Water Utility and the resulting potential debt service that could entail, additional revenue may be required in 26, 27 and years forward. And this will need to be addressed through a combination of either third-party grants for some of the capital and or increased rates to the utility to continue to fund its operating and capital expenses. So a rate study will be required, which may result in an increase to the current rates. Funds for a study have been budgeted under purchase services. So we're not doing a rate study. We haven't done one yet, but it's likely within level of capital that one will be needed in the next year or two. As in prior years, it's anticipated that the accumulated surplus, so you can see at the bottom the 1.8 million that we've been building up, will be utilized for the significant capital work taking place. Over the past number of years, we've been building a surplus with the goal of using it for this capital. Debt and transfers to reserves include transfers to the depreciation reserve in line with anticipated annual depreciation, as well as debt service for the existing debentures. So no debt service for future debentures would be factored in here. The next section of the budget document, on page 127, we do some sort of future year, multi-year looking forward projections, and we do list out the assumptions that we've used in those projections. But numerous factors outside the municipality's control will obviously affect these future budgets. This is just sort of our estimate of where things could be going. And again, the municipality has a small level of control over things like mandatory expenses. You know, the capital that's being required now is really non-discretionary and things like that. And we've also got forecasts prepared for municipal sewer and Greenwood water, which are available on page 131 and 132. So this is sort of just based on what we've seen historically, and if that trending continues, what we could see going forward. And now the final section would be the operating reserves. Now the operating reserves are a distinct fund of the municipality. At March 31st, 2024, so our last audit date, they were at $15.4 million. We are forecasting them to increase to $17.2 million. A portion of that would be some project carryover funds that would be placed into reserve for utilization next year. And a forecast ending balance next year, March 31st, 2026, of $14.6 million. In this chart, which is on page 134 of the agenda, lists out all of the operating reserves. So the operating reserves are a fund of themselves, but within that fund, there are reserves for specific things that, so we have, a J-class paving reserve. So we have a special project reserve. So that would be the reserve that would hold all of this carry forward money that would flow from year to year. And then of course, we've got our Valley Waste Reserve to sort of smooth any blips that you might see there. And then our main reserve, which is the general operating reserve, which would be used to smooth county operations. Within the budget on page 138, we detail all of the transfers coming in and coming out of the operating reserve for the year. So some of the key transfers would include $40,000 coming out from sewer operating reserve as carry forward funds, 1.57, so close to 1.6 million of special project reserve money. So this is money that would have been budgeted for projects. Due to timing issues and delays, it might have been put into the reserve to be used for the same project just in another year. We've got 832,000 of project funding coming from the general operating reserve, and the bulk of this would tie back to that special project chart within the administrative department. So this would sort of be where that is funding those. And then additionally, we have $873,400 coming out of the Valley Waste Reserve to fund current year operations. This represents excess funds that were being held in the Valley Waste Reserve, which are now free to be distributed. And conversely, we have transfers to reserves that we're also putting money back in, totaling $839,000. And this primarily includes the enhanced transfer of $625,000 that the CAO and that I've talked about previously. So we're using some of the assessment lift that we've had in the past years, and we're sort of making sure that our reserves are healthy going forward. It also includes things like interest earned on reserves, contribution based on policy requirements, and things like that. So the other smaller transfers would be those items. So similar to the debt thresholds, the tax affordability thresholds, and things like that, the province also has a threshold for operating reserves. And they publish a report each year on the 49 municipalities in Nova Scotia. So operating reserves, the FCI threshold is operating reserves versus total operating expenditures, less mandatory transfers. And you'll see that the operating expenses won't tie directly back to the budget. They have their own formula for how they calculate operating expenditures. They incorporate regional sewer, and they also sort of adjust the mandatory payments up into tax revenue. So that's why you'll see that the total operating expenses won't match exactly to the budget. So the province considers that a 20% threshold would be the minimum for obtaining a low-risk financial indicator. So that's sort of the minimum that they would, expect to see in your operating reserves. A higher percentage just indicates that the higher balance in operating reserves provides greater flexibility to address unexpected future events. Whereas a low percentage, so anything below 20%, if you start to go into that area, you would have less flexibility to address, unexpected events, emergencies, deficits, things like that. And as you can see, we've put a 5-year history just because we did have sort of a spike in the COVID years where we had the COVID reserve, which was a sort of increased the operating reserves. But you'll see we've been able to maintain just slightly under the 30% mark with our reserves. And while reserve balances fluctuate with the operating expenses growing, obviously, it drives it down. Along with the provincial thresholds, we do have policy thresholds internal to the municipality, and this slide sort of goes over those. So we have 2 thresholds. We have our minimal threshold, which would be 10% of own source revenue, which is calculated and described in the policy on reserves. And then the optimal threshold would be just the operating reserve, just the general reserve. So take away all of the money that's set aside for specific things, and what do you actually have to sort of cushion the municipality. So as you can see, the threshold for each of those is 10%, and we're well above for each of those. And we're maintaining sort of where we've been historically. So that's sort of the end of my presentation for today. If there's any questions, I'm here to answer them.
Okay.
And then
Thank you, Katrina. And before I open up for questions, I'll make a couple of quick comments. On page 43, and you don't have to go there, but I'm pleased to see that you're not being overly optimistic on the money that we're going to get for assessment increases for 2025-26. So it goes back to my previous comments that there may be growth, but I'm not so sure that the property values are going to keep escalating like they have been. So I'm pleased to see that we're not being overly optimistic and end up with a big fall. The other thing is that just a quick comment that it's nice to see the comparisons with for tax rates with the other municipalities, and it sort of appears that Kings County is doing well, and then also it's good to show the towns too, because the towns, local towns I'm talking about, are partners, but they are also our competition too in some areas. So it's good to see that, but I think we have to be careful when we look at tax rates. For example, Chester, as an example, has a very low tax rate, but their assessment and properties in Chester would be, a lot of waterfront properties would be very high, so they might have a very low rate, but a very high assessment. So anyway, it's, I think your presentation was excellent, and I
Thank you.
want to thank you, and very, very informative. And now we'll open it up to questions to council. And as you can appreciate, council, this is an overview of the whole thing. Today's not a day to get into the weeds on a specific individual item, but so that will be for the next day. But all right, and first we got flashing there, Councillor Gates.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. One of the items I did see was a water rate study that we are looking to one of those. Do you know just a ballpark, what that will cost for moving forward?
So we've put in the budget around $25,000. It will depend on if that was based on, I had reached out to somebody who had recently done one, and sort of what they had seen. And it'll, again, depend on how much in-house resource we have to sort of do some of it our own and whatnot. But we have put money into the budget. And again, the rate study timing will sort of be contingent on sort of the completion of the capital project taking place. So the timing of the rate study has always been sort of planned to align with the completion of some of that capital work.
Councillor Hiltz.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, page 70, Community Development and Rec Grants. I just noticed it was down by 60.7%. Is that because of applications in the past or perceived?
I don't have the actual budget here, sorry. Which?
Okay, it was 84,650 last year, and it's proposed at 33,000 this year.
Yeah. Can you just tell me what grants are included in it? Sorry. Like,
Pardon me, what?
can you just list out some of the grants that are in that chart?
Oh,
Sorry. They just all have similar names. But for the grant, so what we do is each December we meet with our grant coordinator here and with the WCAO, and we look at sort of not what's being given out, but what's being asked. So if a program has a budget of $50,000, but for the past 3 years we've had $120,000 of asks, that's what sort of flags which programs need budget adjustments. So sort of like, is the budget keeping pace with the application volume? Is sort
okay,
of what
just anticipating?
that's what we do for all the grant programs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, good. Well, I guess it must have been pretty informative, because there's no other questions, Katrina. So
Perfect.
that tells me that it was pretty informative, and I would ask a motion of council to receive the presentation, moved by Councillor Lutz, second by Councillor Best. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. Motion carried. Thank you very much. And is there any other business coming before council today? No? Well, then we'll move on to the public comment period, and we're going to get through that right quick before somebody comes in. I didn't say that, did I? All right. Seeing that there's nobody in the audience except for the illustrious Terry Brown and Katrina, we'll move on. So, we get a motion to adjourn. Moved by Deputy Mayor Beckford, second by Councillor Hiltz. All those in favor, raise your right hand. Motion carried. Thank you. You can get